We are very, very honored to have this incredible person here. I know that each and every one of you knows how fabulous he is, and now we get to be completely and utterly entertained by him. So some applause for this great guy.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me back there? Yeah. Okay, well thank you all for coming tonight. This is really spectacular that you all came, and I'm very flattered. And I want to thank Diana and also Copperfield Books for arranging this whole thing. And I also want to just briefly introduce one person that may be coming up here and eating tea while I'm talking. Wendy So right here. Okay. And should I happen to trip over the tripod and crack my head, lose my memory, she's heard me talk so many times. She'll just continue with the talk, so no problems. Good to have a backup plan. So, one thing that they got wrong was the title of my talk, and I didn't actually realize this. I was seeing the publicity and going, why are they focused on Mushrooms Demystified, that book, rather than All the Rain Promises? Because it's called Mushrooms Demystified. I had told them the title actually was Mushrooms Demythified. And I think they thought I made a mistake. I never make mistakes. So, actually, I hope that doesn't cause any problems because I'm not going to be talking much about like demystifying, identifying mushrooms or anything like that. I wanted to address some common mushroom myths, and that's why the title of it should be Mushrooms Demythified. Okay, so starting out, most of the myths that I want to talk about are actually all connected. And there's one that isn't, that's totally different. So I'm just going to start with that one so that the rest of the program's got at least a little continuity to it, hopefully. So I thought I would just address this myth that, okay, how many people here are mushroom hunters? Okay, I asked the wrong question. How many people are not? Okay, well there's quite a few that aren't. All right, so how many people here struggle somewhat with the Latin names of mushrooms? Okay, quite a few. And that's because, in part because we don't have a strong mushroom hunting tradition in America. There's a strong immigrant traditions, but the mainstream Anglo tradition is very much to stay away from mushrooms. Therefore, there's very few actual legitimate common names in English for mushrooms, so we have to use the Latin to communicate. All right, so there's a myth, though, that there's a certain way to pronounce the Latin, and you'll encounter some people that will actually correct you. If you say Rusula, they'll say, you mean Russia, or something like that. So this is the first myth I wanted to just address very briefly with a story. So how many people here know what Amanita is? It's a genus of mushrooms, a group of mushrooms that contains some really deadly ones, some really delicious ones, some intoxicating ones also. So how many people here pronounce that name, Amanita? Anybody here? Just a couple. Okay. It used to be when I was learning mushrooms, there was a mycologist in California, the mycologist here, who said Amanita. So all his students said Amanita, and he said Amanita because his professor taught him that was correct. But Latin is a dead language, and so nobody really knows. And I really hadn't thought about this much, really. Now, how many people here, does anybody know the genus for pine trees? Pinus. Well, that's very interesting. Amanita and Pinus. There doesn't seem to be much consistency here. And I hadn't really thought about this much until I was in Europe, actually, only my second time in Europe, a long time ago. And I had just gotten, just left a part of Europe that I liked, but I remember the last morning there, this breakfast that came to me, this enormous sausage about this long, and nothing else. That was breakfast, a big sausage. And for somebody that, I do eat meat, but not that often, this was kind of intimidating, and I wanted something else. I said, can you bring me something to eat with my sausage? I was thinking toast, I don't know, just lettuce, anything. So they came out with a tub of lard, which I was supposed to spread on my sausage. Okay, so, but fortunately, I got on the train. I was going to Italy, and more specifically to Tuscany. So I get to Tuscany on the train. I had these two mycologists there meet me. Now, one of them, I had not met either one, but one of them I had communicated by letter or email. I think there was email, I'm not sure. Anyway, so he spoke some English, and the other one did not speak any English. But they had arranged to meet me at the train station and host me a couple of weeks in Tuscany. So they picked me up in a tiny car, a little Fiat, and take me out on this highway went through the countryside, and I'm like, I'm so happy to be here. Okay. So the guy that does not speak English is driving the car, and they give me the seat of honor, the passenger seat next to him, and the guy that does speak some English is in the back. And so we're driving along, and I'm looking out at the slanting rays of sunshine on the olive groves, and I'm like, oh my God, Tuscany! The 100-year-old vineyards, the 500-year-old olive trees, the truffles, etc. And as I'm having this kind of reverie in my mind, the man in the back seat leans forward between the seats and says to me, "Would you like to see the biggest penis in Tuscany?" And I'm like, I was apoplectic, meaning speechless. I was like, did I hear this right? Maybe he wants to show me the biggest peanuts in Tuscany, which would be weird. I mean, I'd rather see the olives and the truffles and the wine, the vineyards, but biggest peanuts in Tuscany. Well, anyway, but no, he said the biggest penis in Tuscany, and I'm stunned. I really don't know what to say. I didn't want to be rude and say, no way, because I'm going to be with him for a week or two. So I just thought, well, let me take stock of the situation here. I'm in a little car, driving 70 miles an hour down the highway with two strange men I've never met, and one of them wants to show me the biggest penis in Tuscany. Not good. I just kept quiet. I really didn't know what to say. And then after what seemed like an eternity, it was probably just a couple of minutes, the same person leans forward again, this guy, and says, "Well, it's up here, 5 kilometers up the road." And I'm thinking, wow. Oh, I'm so glad. I mean, at least it's not in the car with me. I mean, wow. I felt like, geez. And so then, he wants to know if I want to see it. And my first intake is to just say, no thank you. But I'm actually kind of curious about this. I mean, how big is big? That's the first question. And then the second, how does this work exactly? Is there a guy in a booth by the road? I mean, I really wonder what the hell is going on here. I mean, I know when people visit me, I want to show them the biggest redwood tree in California, right, etc. So maybe it's not that. Anyway, so I really hadn't made any connection yet. And so we go on a few kilometers, and then we turn off the main highway, go another kilometer down a small road, and pull up, and he points to it. And it's a pine tree. It's a frickin' pine tree. And then, it was only then that I understood. It's their way of saying, well, we say pinus because we don't want to say that other word. But actually, penis is probably much closer to the Latin. And of course, at that point, I then had to say, well, this isn't much of a penis, really. We have much bigger penises in America. We've got the ponderosa penis and the sugar penis. And we got these kinky ones, like the contorted penis contorta. Otherwise known as the lodgepole penis. Anyway, okay, so the bottom line is simply that there is no correct way to pronounce these words. So don't worry about it. That's possible. Bernie's going to plug in. We didn't bring the kind that you can lift off the kettle, so she's going to plug it in. And since I'm not going to watch the kettle, then she'll watch when it boils. It doesn't turn off automatically. Very primitive model. Okay, so I was recently asked a question. It was in a discussion group. I don't remember which one actually. It was on Facebook. But I was interested because I've been thinking about this. Related to mushrooms, if somebody asked me if there's one thing I could teach people about mushrooms, what would it be? And actually the answer when I was 20 years old is quite different than when I was 30 years old, and when I was 40 years old, and now. And I asked this question of other people, and they came up with a lot of good answers. Some people talked about telling people to be cautious, for example. Like there's a saying that's another myth that's, you probably know it. Maybe you can help me say this one because I've heard it so many times I can hardly stand to say it. But I'll give you the first 3 words and let's see how many people know it. Okay, so there are old. Okay, come on. There are bold mushrooms. Come on, I can't say it. Okay, yeah. So that serves a function because for people that don't know about mushrooms, that helps to keep them away from mushrooms. But it's actually a lie because there's a lot of old mushrooms. There's other people that wanted to teach people about the special properties that mushrooms had. Yeah, you're supposed to. Thank you. Oh my God. Good, Wendy. Okay. Anyway. By the way, she's doing that. In case you wondered about this is my newest best prop. I had a cold head today. Not a head cold, but a cold head. So I bought this wool hat to go over my head. And then there was a pipe there for sale too, real cheap. And I thought this would look really good with a hat. I don't know how to hold it exactly, but anyway, that's why this is here. Okay. So, for me now, the thing that I think the one message that I would give, if I had to choose most anything to say about mushrooms, would be simply that it's not about the mushrooms. And I'll make that clear a little bit later, what I mean by that. So, since this started out scheduled as a reading, meaning it was going to be at Copperfield Books, and I guess maybe with 20 people showing up or something. So I'll start by actually reading something from my book, but and then go from there. So this is I just made it easier to read by blowing it up. But this is a story from my little book here, All the Rain Promises and More. This year I'm turning in a total revision to my publishers, so it'll be out in a year. It'll be about 30% longer, but it'll still fit into your hip pocket, so that's the best part of it. And it'll have a lot of new material in it, almost all new photos except the cover. Anyway, so I'm just going to read a story here because it illustrates what I just told you. So this is a story called Mining for Mushrooms. Okay, and it goes like this. It was a long time ago in my hippie days. I was living on a commune and I was sick and tired of all the bickering and brown rice. I really needed some space. So I split for Arizona where I heard there was nothing but. So get this, we're driving down this crusty, dusty desert road on the way to a scenic overlook, the most unlikely place in the world for mushrooms. And I see this glimmer of white in a ditch by the road. We stop for a look, and sure enough, it's an old Agaricus bitorcus. Jade says it must be the only shroom in the state of Arizona, and I'm about to agree when I start noticing all these cracks everywhere in the hard red clay along the road. It was Shroom City. There were hundreds of them, big clumps of them, veins of them, but all underground. Most were several inches under, some more than a foot. Dig this, I said to Jade. With what, she wanted to know. We used our hands, making piles of them on the road as we walked along. Of course, we were noticed. An RV stopped, and this older couple from Long Beach got out and wanted to know what we were doing. We're mining for mushrooms, I said, pausing for effect. And we've just struck the mother lode. We could tell they really wanted to try their hand at it. They sold life insurance and had been traveling for 3 months, visiting every national park in the country. And this was their final stop, their last scenic overlook. And they were so burned out, they really wanted something to do exciting. But duty called. They just had to go on to the overlook. 5 minutes later, they were back for some fun. Along with everything else in the world, they had brand new shovels with them, which they'd been wanting to use for months. And they started pulling giant buttons out of the ground, like clams. Boy, were they still. Mushrooms. Edible mushrooms under the sun-baked desert crust. It was totally incredible to them. It wasn't in their tourist guides or on their itinerary. The Auto Club hadn't said anything about it. It had never occurred to them to eat raw mushrooms, so they just got more and more excited and started scurrying around, yelping and babbling like kids. Look at the son of a gun over here. Mine's even bigger than yours. Holy cow, it's hard as a rock. I can't believe I'm doing this. Another RV pulled over to see what all the commotion was about. One of them also sold insurance, and of course they had shovels too, so they dug right in. Then another RV joined us, a Mormon family from Moab, a bicyclist bound for Lubbock, and 2 local Navajo. We must have pulled up a couple 100 pounds, and we left loads behind. Talk about, quote, overlook. We wouldn't have gotten any if that one old cap hadn't made it above the ground. There was only one campground in the area, and we were all staying there, so that night we had this incredible spontaneous mushroom feast with gourmet foods and drinks they'd stashed away in their RVs for that one really special occasion, and what could be more special than this? We ate fabulously and got along famously, and a couple from Long Beach wanted to know if this was what it was like to live communally. And I said, sure, we do this every night. I guess you could say we made their day. In fact, they said it was the best thing that happened on their whole trip. We had more for breakfast the next morning, and the sun dried the rest, and that one couple just couldn't stop talking about how excited they were. I kept getting letters from them afterwards, and I bet they're still talking about it. 25 years later, telling their grandchildren about the mighty, once-in-a-blue-moon shroom bloom beneath the Arizona desert. Me, I'm not much of a talker, but I'm sure tempted to go back. I never did make it to that scenic overlook. Thank you, Wendy, for the tea. So, that story, I like that story for a couple of reasons. One is it illustrates a couple of really fundamental things about what it is to be human. Now, why did they get so excited about the mushrooms? Okay, well, one reason might be just that it was something that they hadn't done before, something new. A lot of tourists go out just to do something new. But I would submit that it's also because they were doing something very ancient. It's something which is in our DNA, which is something unmediated by the whole food chain of supermarkets and farmers and everything else that we call civilization. They were finding these things. Somehow they believed, I mean, I was like a hippie then, but they believed me that they were edible. All you gotta do is use the Latin name, Agaricus bitorquis. Yes. Anyway. And so they really got into it for that reason. And also because this is an agaricus, it actually looks a lot like the kind of thing that you can buy in a store. So that could have had something to do with them trusting me. But anyway, the point is that they weren't just doing something new, but they were doing something very ancient. Now, I'm going to tell you another story. That's another road story. Okay? This is about a guy named George the Greek. And I haven't actually had any contact with George for about 10 years, but he lives in Visalia. And you probably know Visalia is outside of Fresno. Okay, the country is very flat. Doesn't seem like, very mushroom hunting territory, right? So he would call up occasionally, and at that time I lived in Santa Cruz, and he would call up occasionally. And he had some kind of endearing characteristics. He had a thick accent. He had a job that he never told me anything about, never talked about it. So clearly that wasn't his passion. He was constantly popping pills for, I think it was some kind of blood pressure ailment or something like that. And he would also talk at with such volume. I mean, if he was up here talking, he wouldn't need the microphone. So he would just have this terrific, he'd be shouting without actually realizing it. So he calls up one day and says, oh, and one other thing, I'm not sure whether this is actually because he sees double or it's just his habit, but he always called me, rather than David, he called me Davids. Like there's two of me. Okay, maybe one and one, I don't know, but anyway, I didn't want to ask about it. So he says, he calls up and said, Davids, there's mushrooms over here. You've got to come see them. And I'm like, I'm in Santa Cruz, Visalia, Santa Cruz is beautiful, it's a nice spring day, it's like lovely sunshine, ocean breeze. Do I want to go to Visalia? Not really. But I think it's a long drive, so I called my friend William and I say, William, would you like to accompany me there? There's some cool mushrooms apparently there. So he comes along. So we drive there. George greets us in his little apartment, and we all get into George's tiny VW and start driving. And he's of course driving. We've got William in the front seat, I'm in the back, and we're going through orchards, and they all look the same, orchard after orchard. And then he suddenly slams on the brakes, stops the car, slams on the brakes, and goes, Davids! Williams! Look! And we look. It's an orchard like any other orchard. We don't see any mushrooms there. And he says, there! We look again. Well, actually, it's kind of like this. No mushrooms. 12 years ago, it was white with them. We drive on the ways again. He guns it. We drive on the ways. He slams on the brakes and says, Davids! Williams! Look! We look again. No mushrooms. 8 years ago, they were everywhere. And we got this tour like that for like half an hour of all these places that at one time or another had mushrooms. And to me, it was actually like a great teaching moment because, well, first it's interesting because, we've got this saying that familiarity breeds contempt. And that's kind of a modern saying, and that's why maybe people like to travel and be tourists and see new things, do new things. But actually, there may be some truth in that, but it's also very much true that familiarity breeds content. And it's only through being familiar with someone or something or some place or some organism that we build up a richness of memory and connection. And so what was going on here was that he was very much, each time he saw a place that he had found a huge, memorable, or not even huge necessarily, but a memorable mushroom pick. That place, which to us was indistinguishable from every other orchard outside Visalia, to him it was a special spot. And it had memory. It was evocative. And that's really what makes us, I think, our lives are not just a collection of moments, but they're a connection, because we have things that are evocative, that call to us at other times and other places. And so he was kind of, each time that he saw this, he was in the moment. And it wasn't the same moment that William and I were in, but he was very much in the moment and in that place. And another interesting thing about this is this whole concept of mushrooms as being part of nature. And are these orchards? Obviously the orchard trees are not natives, and by some definitions they're not nature. And he's driving through miles and miles of the planned and the tamed and the orderly and predictable, in search of the unplanned and the untamed and the disorderly and the unpredictable. And the mushrooms themselves, we don't even know whether they're native or not. Some of them were agaricus, there was also shaky parasols, but really, on some deep level, at least to me, it didn't really matter. And what mattered was that he had this really obvious and very deep and compelling relationship with not only the mushrooms, but the orchards there. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple other myths, okay? So a lot of, there's all kinds of websites, and you can read all kinds of stuff on there that simply isn't true, as well as stuff that is. But it's I think really difficult often, for people to decipher what is and what isn't. So like there's often, even the books coming out, there's a lot of foraging books, especially also mushroom books, but there's some foraging books that have come out recently. And they have various statements like, I'll actually show a couple to you, but there's a couple statements like things like that, truffles have been over-harvested in Europe. There's another one, actually this one here. I don't even know where it is now, but another, this says the porcini were over-harvested in Italy, matsutake were over-harvested in Japan, and that's actually, there's no evidence that that's the case. There are definitely declines of mushrooms in some areas, and they haven't been attributed to picking them. And you also often read about, don't do this, like don't wash mushrooms, don't boil mushrooms, don't dig up the mushrooms. I've read that it's best to cut the mushroom off at ground level. There's some people that are very insistent upon this point, and yet the studies, which I will show you actually, I'll be showing you some pictures, and I'll briefly show you just the title page, so you can Google it later if you want to. But there's actually more than one study that shows it doesn't matter whether you pick the mushrooms, whether you pick all the mushrooms by digging them up, whether you cut all the mushrooms, or whether you don't pick the mushrooms. It makes no difference. And there's actually a lot of evidence also just anecdotally from the fact that there's areas in the world the mushrooms have been gathered for centuries and they're still there. And these same areas are places that often, I spend a lot of time in villages, and they're villages where the big game has been hunted out long ago. And even the smaller mammals are often scarce. So there's definitely I mean, humans obviously impact those organisms, but berries, mushrooms, some other things like that seem to be relatively immune to that. But you'll keep reading, don't do this and don't do this, and a common one is don't pick mushrooms along roads, all right, because they're polluted. And the first thing to realize, now, I'm not here to persuade you either way on something like that. Don't pick them, do pick them. It's a personal choice. I'm more interested not in people's personal choices, but in the cultural narrative that generates those choices. So, what's interesting here is if you Google mushrooms, berries, because a lot of people pick berries, and berries often grow on roadsides. Google mushrooms, berries, and poisoning, and see what you come up with. Warning after warning after warning after warning. I wanted to find some cases. I'm not saying it can't be poisoned, but I thought there would also be a lot of cases of people getting poisoned. And there aren't. So, one thing to realize is any book that emphasizes the don'ts, and for all I know, Mushroom Demystified might do that too, because I wrote that a long time ago. And that one I'm also revising, but that's going to take a while. Anyway, the don't is the most primitive form of authority. It's a parental authority. It's a form of authority that's telling people, especially children, don't do this, like don't cross the street, don't play with matches. And they're doing it because the children presumably haven't developed the intellectual capacity to really understand the results or the consequences of their actions. And so it's very easy to try to establish authority. A book, somebody that's writing a book that wants to establish authority, the easiest way is to start out telling people, don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't pick mushrooms on roadsides, blah, 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 blah. And I'm much more interested in trying to teach people to do things. And I think that does take a little more knowledge and I think perspective. So there is a study that came out of England that looked at roadside mushrooms and berries, and it found that the ones in urban areas did have higher concentrations of pollutants than those in rural areas, but concluded at the frequency that people eat them, that they didn't pose a health danger. And there may be other studies. I'm not trying to persuade somebody either way, but I think that there's a couple of things going on here. One being that there's a lot of people taking interest in mushrooms, in being outdoors. I mean, part of that is simply trying to get out into a more natural environment, or what we perceive as natural anyway. And so I found this story with George very, very interesting because he was getting it from orchards. But one thing I don't see with this whole thing of picking roadsides, people, they just say, don't pick roadside mushrooms. Well, I've never seen anybody address the question of, well, are there consequences for not picking roadside mushrooms? And actually there are, which none of these stories I told you, like mining for mushrooms, those were roadside mushrooms. George, those were roadside mushrooms. I could tell you a dozen other stories. So in a way, there are consequences for not eating roadside mushrooms too. And I think that we lose something. And part of it is, if you're gonna go to the woods, okay, and you're gonna get geared up, most people will have to set aside some time and get their gear together, and they'll have to drive too, in order to do it. Whereas the roads and paths have always functioned for people down through the centuries as the ways that they get from place to place and things that they find along the way. There's a whole cuisine in Southeast Asia built around roadside ditches. And I actually wrote an article about all the foods that come from rice paddies and ditches along rice paddies, more than 100 different foods. So anyway, I'm wandering a little, but another consequence let me just give you one more consequence of not picking along roads, which is I grew up in LA. And as a kid, before knowing anything about mushrooms, as a kid, I picked and loved to gather eugenia berries and sourgrass along roads. In those days, the cars had gasoline too. And if my parents had said, don't pick things along the road, I wouldn't be here standing before you, probably. So, next question, next myth. I referred to this earlier. So the myth of cutting versus picking versus not picking. And a lot of websites and books try to apply things that are applicable and appropriate for plants or animals to mushrooms, like only pick 50% or whatever the percentage. It's always an arbitrary number. Might be 10%, might be 90%. Okay, the problem with this, the studies show that it doesn't matter. And the problem with telling people that there's a right way to do something is it implies or actually states, in some cases, that there's a wrong way. So it's actually a very divisive thing to do, because if you're teaching people that you should cut them off above the ground, and they see people often from much older mushroom gathering traditions, by the way, much more knowledgeable people often, who dig up the whole mushroom, then they're making judgments about those people. And there's already so many divisions in the world. Why should we be making more over something trivial? And it is trivial because the studies are very clear. It doesn't matter. So I just tell people, hey, if you feel like picking them all, go ahead. If you don't feel like picking any, don't. If you feel like picking some, do. The main thing, what I find, people talk about health benefits of mushrooms. My belief is far and away the greatest health benefit is for people to actually be out hunting the mushrooms, because, I mean, that brings up your endorphins. We're doing what we were sort of, it's in our DNA to do, which is not all this huge society. We grew up as small pack animals, and we're out there maybe with a couple friends gathering things to eat. And that just really speaks on a very primitive and deep level to us. And I think that that's the great, for me anyway, the great health benefit. And if you're stressing too much, if there was a reason not to pick them all, I could understand it, but there is no biological reason. Sometimes there's a regulatory reason, if it's 5 pounds or something, but otherwise, no. Now, you can tell people this over and over and show them the studies, I will, and there's people that don't believe it. And that's fine, but one reason they don't, I think, is that essentially we are visual creatures. So take the case of blackberries, or let's say huckleberries, all right, because I've got huckleberries growing all over my land. So if I go out one summer and pick all these huckleberries off a bush, and I come back the next year and there's no huckleberries on it, I don't say, oh no, I picked all the huckleberries last year. It didn't make any huckleberries. I don't blame myself. One reason, I can see the bush. The bush is healthy, it's green. I understand something about huckleberries. It's in my culture. We may not be mushroom hunters in America, but we are to some degree berry pickers. So I understand that, yeah, the crops aren't the same every year, that they come and they go. Sometimes they're pollinated, sometimes they're not, whatever. I can see that there's a live bush there. Or if I came back the next year and I saw that the bush was dead, I wouldn't say, oh no, I picked all the huckleberries, the bush died. No, because I understand something about the huckleberry. So I would know that maybe it just died of old age, maybe disease came in. But when it's mushrooms, you can't see the mycelium in the ground. So there was a very well-known mushroom cultivator that I visited, and he took me to a chanterelle patch on his property and said, David, I picked a whole bunch of chanterelles here last year, and they haven't come back this year. Do you think I shouldn't have picked them all? This is somebody who cultivates mushrooms. He should know, and intellectually, he does know, of course, but on some level, because he can't see the mycelium, he worried that he had done something wrong. And 2 years later, he calls me on the phone and says, "David, they're back!" I go, "What's back?" "The chanterelles!" So they did come back. They took a couple years off. That happens. Sometimes they die. And that happens too. But anyway, so part of people's reluctance, I think, is simply that we don't, if we came from a mushroom-loving culture, we would understand more, like we do with berries, that picking the mushrooms has no effect on the parent mycelium. But since we don't come from a mushroom-loving culture, and because we're also very visually oriented creatures, I think that we have this distrust of picking the mushrooms. And again, you don't have to pick them all, but I would just say don't judge those that do. Okay. Then there's another myth I want to talk about, that this is actually part of this reluctance to pick mushrooms. And it's actually nested within a larger myth called undisturbed nature, okay, which is an oxymoron. If you know anything about nature, you know that disturbance is a part of nature. And of course, humans have create a lot of disturbance, but because it's a part of nature, then disturbance in itself is neither good nor bad. It's all in how much disturbance there is. So we tend to get often, and I'm talking about everybody, even me sometimes, get worried about disturbance, but mushrooms themselves are, especially edible mushrooms, many of them are either tolerant of disturbance or actually like disturbance. Now, many of them grow on edges, on the interfaces of forest and open areas, or roadsides, or trail sides. Why would it be that there's a high proportion of edible mushrooms that grow along trails? Why would that be? Anybody? Yeah.
Because the edge of the mycelium has been exposed to the air.
Okay, the edge of the mycelium is exposed, but that wouldn't explain why they were edible. So I'll just say I've come to this insight, what I consider an insight. You can just miss it if you want. But having spent a lot of time in villages around the world, our knowledge of mushrooms came mostly from villages in other countries. Now, of course, we've adopted into local species, but consider an amanita, like Amanita villosa. How many people here know what Amanita villosa is? It's a really wonderful edible amanita that grows in the springtime. We call it the springtime amanita. Really delicious mushroom, but when I was writing Mushroom Demystified, its edibility was unknown, and I ate it. And it sounds like that might be reckless because amanitas contain deadly ones, but I borrowed knowledge from other continents. Well, the mushrooms, the amanitas that are closely related to the mushroom are eaten elsewhere. And therefore, really, my knowledge and my willingness to try it was really standing on the shoulders of these other villages and their knowledge around the world. And spending time in these villages, I found that it's actually pretty obvious that the forests around the villages are quite impacted by villagers. They're out there every day gathering herbs, gathering firewood, clearing brush, hunting. They even graze animals sometimes. So there's a lot of activity in the forests around each village. So mushrooms that can't handle that kind of activity, and they're also cutting trees. Mushrooms that can't handle that kind of activity, that only grow in old growth, undisturbed, quote, truly relatively undisturbed nature, would not tolerate those conditions. And so the mushrooms that were common around the villages, the mushrooms that people would then naturally, one selection process was selecting out the mushrooms that could tolerate or were favored by disturbance. The second process is the process of choosing mushrooms to eat which would naturally be those that are big and common, or both. Big because we're big creatures. If they're small like handicaps, they have to be common. They have to be recognizable too, so that you can distinguish them from other mushrooms. And they have to be common around the village. So then we selected out certain kinds like boletes and morels, etc. So when people talk about or have ideas about protecting mushroom diversity, there are certainly kinds that only grow in old growth, no doubt. But in terms of the edible mushrooms that people usually gather, most of them overwhelmingly are mushrooms that favor edges or that favor some kind of disturbance of area. And I'll show you a couple pictures of this. Another reason that's also obvious about the edges is that we as creatures are very good at creating edges. Sometimes incidentally, because we make roads and paths to get somewhere, that creates edges. Some people are very worried about compacting the soil in terms of mushrooms and other plants. But every time that there's a path created through the woods, it also creates two edges. So you get some different organisms growing in those edges, including mushrooms. There's a study that showed, and I'll show you again so that you can Google it, that came from Switzerland looking at mushroom diversity and numbers in a mature forest in Switzerland. And then they cut part of it. They did a fairly severe thinning of it. Not clear cutting, but thinning it. And then they documented in the ensuing years that in the areas that they thinned versus the areas they did not, that both mushroom diversity and numbers jumped quite significantly. No, not yet. Hopefully not. Are you? Our plan is actually, I'm just going to talk a little longer and then show you just some pictures, mostly visuals, real quickly. It won't take that long. And then I have a couple stories to read afterwards. So that's the plan here. So, another myth. Here's an easy one, okay? Well, there's a myth of, actually, we're connected with this myth of undisturbed nature. And this will actually connect to something that I'll read later, which is, so you're all familiar with Yosemite National Park. And so when John Muir was describing it, John Muir came from a movement of romantics that romanticized nature. It was a very different view of nature than the people that actually lived in Yosemite Valley, which were Miwok Indians. So he would describe it typically in terms of like going to nature to be with God or something along that line. And what's interesting after that, the famous photographers like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston that came to Yosemite to immortalize it, and they were very careful. During the 20th century, when they were working there was still the Miwok Indian village in Yosemite Valley, and there were Miwok people all over the place still working, usually menial jobs, for the Park Service there. And Ansel Adams, as well as the others, were very careful to never show those people in their photographs. So there was definitely, it was art, but it was, at the same time, it was art, it was propaganda. And you can, if you believe in national park creation, then you can say that that was good propaganda, I mean, for a good cause. But it was propaganda in the sense that it was distorting reality. So the cliffs, the waterfalls, the big rocks, those were there before humans. But the actual landscape in the valley, the widely spaced trees, the park-like setting, those were actually created by repeated burnings by the Miwok who lived there. John Muir actually promulgated a myth that they were visitors, that he described Miwok as the first visitors to the valley. And actually, he had contemporaries, this anthropologist named Galen Clark, who actually told him, no, they've been living there for more than 4,000 years. And now we think it's actually longer than that. But anyway, it was part of creating this idea that Yosemite should be a place for all Americans to go and ironically get away from it all. But if you go to the valley, you know that's not true. The Miwok were actually evicted 3 different times. The last time was in 1969. And but that valley, that beautiful park-like setting, it's actually changed quite a bit. But it's they burned for several reasons. One was because their staple item was acorns, and the big oaks that had the best acorn crops, if they didn't burn regularly every several years, the conifers growing up would shade those trees, and they wouldn't get good crops of acorns. So they did it to keep the conifers down. They also did it because there was a grub that would infect acorns, and if they did periodically, burning would interfere with that cycle to keep the number of grubs down. They also did it because anybody knows it creates edges, and edges are favored by game, like deer, because all this rich understory and grassland grows there, which is what the animals like to feed on. So they were hunters, so they liked burning because that attracted game. And they also did it because they picked morels too. And any other details, if anybody's interested, you can read this in a wonderful book by Kat Anderson, an anthropologist. She wrote a book called Tending the Wild. So that's something that happened. I mean, it's happened now. I think the hardest part for me, traveling around to different areas, I just came back from Africa, and I often go to Asia. And seeing, in some ways, I mean, that happened a long time ago, but we managed to export that model of park creation. I was in Thailand, in an area that used to belong or was lived in by ethnic Karen villagers. And they got evicted, which is normally what happens with creating a national park. And then these signs went up. I used to go motion hunting with them, actually. But then these signs cropped up. Once the Queen declared it a national park, they were evicted, the villages were burned, and then the signs went up saying, take only pictures, leave only footprints. So this was what we gave them, which has gone all over the world. It's had good effects, and it's also had very bad ones. I wanted to just read you one short thing. This is from a book called Conservation of Refugees. And because I was just in Africa, I chose something that was actually, it was a pygmy woman, and they were evicted from an area that they had lived for generations in Uganda so that they could make a park. And this is done with tacit support from conservation organizations, although it's always the national governments that do it. So it's just a short quote, and she's describing what happened. She said, "We did not know they were coming. It was early in the morning. I didn't know anything was happening until the police ran into my compound. They all had guns. One of them forced open the door of our house and started shouting that we had to leave immediately because the park is not our land. I first did not understand what he was talking about because all my ancestors had lived on these lands. They shouted at me. They told me to run. I had no chance to say anything. They came at us and we ran. They came so violently. I was frightened for the children, but we just ran off in all directions. I took my way and the children took theirs. Other people were running, panicking, even picking up the wrong children in confusion. I lost everything. We're poor now. So, in Africa, where I just was, I was there for about 6 weeks. When I go there, actually like a lot of people, the first time I went to Africa, I went on safari and saw animals. But ever since, I've been there probably about 10 times or so, and I go mushroom hunting and I avoid the parks. I go where people live still and go mushroom hunting with them. So one amazing thing about going mushroom hunting with them on this trip, I mean, I knew this already, but it just comes as such a shock to go there and then to come back here. Going there, you're free to pick mushrooms. I mean, it's just incredible. You can go anywhere and pick mushrooms. There isn't some ranger watching you. And you probably, all your mushroom hunters here, maybe, I mean, there's people that don't hunt mushrooms, maybe you don't know, but it's virtually illegal to pick mushrooms in coastal California. So there's a couple parks that allow it. And of course, with only 1 or 2 parks that allow it, you're funneling everybody that wants to be legal into those areas. And you sort of artificially create this a tragedy of the commons. Not in terms of the mushrooms being pushed out and becoming extinct, but simply that there's a lot of people. And of course, you crowd people in, and then it's like, very competitive, etc. So I love going, whether it's there or in Asia. I love going to these places because, hey, I can actually pick mushrooms and not worry about it. So what's happening, I'm going to summarize this up and then go to the pictures. So what I think is actually going on is that we're here in California, we're in the 3rd stage of a 3-step, and maybe more steps, but at least a 3-step process, in which mushroom knowledge specifically, and mushroom tradition specifically, and forest knowledge more generally, is first forsaken, then forgotten, and finally forbidden. It's forsaken because people, naturally, there's a great movement from villages to cities. That's where the money is, the influence, the power, the opportunity, at least the perceived opportunity to do better. So I think it was a couple of years ago that for the first time humanity became a majority of humanity living in cities, in urban areas rather than the countryside. So anyway, that's the first stage. They're forsaking their homeland and to some degree their knowledge then by moving to the cities and taking labor jobs, etc. So the second step is then forgotten. Well, that happens because people are in the cities. They may go back to visit their parents in the villages.